I think the first thing is right at the first sentence. Yeah, the very first sentence. In the context of persuasion, narrative is most commonly considered in opposition to argumentation. That's a good first statement, first sort of starting point. And we've talked about this a little bit, and the course is actually kind of structured in this way somewhat. We start on the one end of the spectrum with logic and reason and debate and rationality and, formal persuasion, explicit, formal, obvious, central processing, right? Logos, substantial warrants, all of that kind of stuff that's very much about kind of focus and logical rigor and analysis, right? That's normally the way we think about persuasion, as kind of argumentation, as this kind of rational process of appealing to audiences. Well, that assumes that everything that's not that is not persuasive, right? So that would include things like stories and narratives and myths and poems and fiction and film and music and culture in general, perhaps, right? One of the big movements that happened in the 20th century, in the middle portion to the latter portion of the 20th century, is a kind of rejection of that distinction where we have persuasion as reason over here, and we have anything that's not reason not be assumed to be persuasive over here, right? So fiction and short stories and all the rest, art essentially, over there, subjective aesthetic kind of stuff. And sure enough, it was Kenneth Burke. I don't know anyone who was saying it before him. I don't know that anyone who was saying it better, sooner, longer. Kenneth Burke, in the early decades of the 20th century, we're talking like 1920s, he was already writing about the persuasive power of literature, of music. He was a music critic. He wrote music reviews for a magazine called The Dial. He wrote poems. He wrote criticisms of poems. Kenneth Burke was probably a literary and aesthetic, sort of artistic-minded critic before he was anything else. And then he started to realize the rhetorical and persuasive power of the non-rational, right? The aesthetic, the literary, the musical, all of that. And he started writing really powerfully about the persuasive abilities of art itself, art in general, essentially, right? And so it was Burke in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s who was writing about the persuasive power of everything that didn't fall under this tight little grouping that had held sway since Descartes and Ramus in the 16th, 17th century. Everything that had held sway as being persuasion was about logic, argumentation, very technical, very syllogistic, very cut and dried, and then again, everything else was assumed to be just, theater or entertainment or private pleasure or whatever, and it doesn't really matter. And then along comes Kenneth Burke in the 20th century. Again, I think he was first, he was certainly the best, who started saying things like short stories are persuasive, poems are persuasive, music, it's all persuasive if we kind of broaden our understanding of persuasion and rhetoric. After Burke, along comes this guy named Walter Fisher. Now, this is a couple of decades after Burke was starting to write about the persuasive power of aesthetics, of art, literature, music, and so on. Walter Fisher comes along and picks up this idea of narrative as persuasion. And then he writes a whole bunch of pieces about the persuasive power of narratives, comes up with this thing called the narrative paradigm within rhetoric, and it becomes so popular, important, widely cited. It becomes such an essential part of how rhetorical scholars were thinking about the world of influence. Just look out into the world. What matters, right? Well, obviously, not everything that's just a tight little argument matters. Other things matter. Stories matter, right? Newspapers matter. Films matter. Books matter. Not just speeches and arguments, but a whole bunch of other stuff matters. And Walter Fisher was there, and this is, I think, 70s, 80s kind of era. Again, a couple of decades after Burke was saying this first, and Burke was the one who gave us dramatism, which we won't get into, but dramatism is sort of what birthed the narrative, rhetorical, persuasive kind of consciousness, right? So we got Burke on dramatism, and then we've got Walter Fisher on the narrative paradigm, and then we've got everyone else in here who's cited in here from the last, couple of decades. Fisher's not in here, and Burke's not in here. It got me a little bit agitated. It's like the guys who are setting up this whole sort of question of the rhetorical powers of narrative are not even cited in this chapter. So I just wanted to make sure that we got that kind of history here. It was Burke, and then Fisher. And we're not reading Burke, at least not yet, but we are going to read some Fisher today because I think it's important that we see, I think, the master rhetorical critic of narrative, right? Narrative in a very broad sense, and narrative as we might find it anywhere, including in like a scientific text kind of thing. So that's the first kind of major point, is this idea that we need to get rid of this distinction. It's a kind of a false distinction. It's somewhat holds up, but it's still kind of like, let's move beyond this distinction between like the rational and the logical over here and the aesthetic and the irrational over there. And all of this other stuff was like not to be trusted, and it's not even like legitimately rhetorical or persuasive or whatever. The legitimate stuff is the arguments, the debates, the like technical dry stuff. The problem is like most people live their lives in ways where they're being influenced by everything but this logical dry technical stuff, right? So it's the rhetorical scholars who started saying, look, if we care about what matters to people in terms of how they live their lives and what influences them, we got to get beyond just arguments and logic and fallacies and all that dry technical stuff. And we got to look at the stuff that actually reaches people in their everyday lives, including stories and films and news reports and narratives as we see them in news, as we see them, in journalism, as we see them in advertisement, as we see politicians giving us story after story. When I was a son, or my grandpa when he was a little guy, or my grandparents came to this country with $4 in their pocket, and story, narrative, right? If we care about what actually influences people on a daily kind of hourly basis, then we've got to kind of move beyond the super dry technical stuff, which again does matter if we're trying to think logically, central brain, central processing, right? All of that stuff is useful. It provides a way for us to kind of examine the larger arena of activity. But in terms of like what actually influences people, the rhetorical scholars in the 20th century were trying to, and we still are, trying to move in this direction of like what is actually affecting people like now, right here, where they live, where they find themselves, what is finding them, what is moving them. At least that's the way I like to think of it, because I like to think of rhetorical sort of power is, wherever people are being most influenced and most swayed and most moved around and motivated this way and that way. And if it's not speech and if it's not argumentation, then what is it? We're moving in this direction of thinking about the digital, the algorithmic. I think that's the stuff that really matters right now. So we need to wrap our rhetoric brains around that and our persuasion brains around that. Okay, so that's the kind of the opening little preamble bit. Narrative is most commonly considered in opposition to argumentation. Yes, we want to do away with that distinction. And again, Walter Fisher is probably the best at sort of flattening the distinction between narrative on the one side and logic on the other. What he wants to do is he wants to say, sort of like Wolbert, right? Getting back to that brilliant Wolbert essay from a few weeks back. Fisher is going to say, not only is narrative persuasive, but logic and persuasion is narrativistic, right? And so what you do is you find, just like Wolbert said, we find elements of pathos in every logos type moment, right? The way that like mood and the wish infuse everything, right? Walter Fisher would say the same thing. Even in a scientific logos driven type paper where it's all facts and stats and technical, dry and objective and all the rest of it, sure enough, you can still find narrative kind of properties in there. You can find values, you can find desire, you can find all of those kind of, what did he call it, neuromuscular kinds of activities playing out. So it's important that we think of narratives as persuasive, just the way we can also think about arguments as narrative. That's what Fisher's kind of major contribution was. All right, let's see here. Number 1, good. 2, good. Yes, number 3, we find narratives all over the place, right? We find them in ads, we find them in campaign promotions. We find them in political ads and statements by politicians. We find them in debates by politicians. We find stories constantly. All right, we find the narrative element really where anything is attempting to be communicated and conveyed or sold in a very kind of human way. I've been watching the show Suits. Anyone watching Suits out there or have watched Suits? It's like a lawyer procedural kind of drama, office drama. It's fun. It's it's engaging, and there's this one character, one of the main characters, Mike. It's this guy who's got this like photographic memory, and when he was younger, both of his parents died, and he was raised by his grandmother. And he's always sad about the fact that his parents died when he was young. And sure enough, in these key moments where he's trying to win over a client, if he learns that that client has lost someone close to them, like a daughter or son or whatever, Mike will try to win them over by telling the sad story about his parents and how he knows what it's like to be alone. He knows what it likes to lose someone. And it's always awkward because it's like, the character's being sincere, but at the same time, the rhetorical critic in me is like, you're just pulling one over here. You're just pulling out the sad dead parent story so that you can win over this client and make, tens of millions of dollars or whatever. But that precisely is what we're talking about here. Narratives are engaging. It's been a while since I've taught in front of a body of students, a group of students physically present in class. But I've done it long enough to know that, like, when you're going through a reading and it's dry and technical or people are tired or whatever, you start to see them kind of nod off. And if you want to kind of perk the class back up, what do? Tell a story. Tell a personal story, tell an anecdote, make up a story. People love stories, man. They lean forward. It's why we sit around the campfire and tell scary stories. We don't need anything else, just our minds, our words, right? Being able to conjure these kinds of awesome, exciting kind of worlds for each other. There's something about that that's deeply, deeply human, that's deeply a part of who we are. We sit on the couch in the evening, we watch our shows, we watch our platforms, we watch our TV shows, our movies, our documentaries, whatever. And it's really like sitting around the campfire telling stories to each other. Stories are just something that we really, really connect to, right? And so they're inherently kind of persuasive in that way. And that's why they are so powerful as sources of persuasive mediation, right? Now, this chapter wants to get into some of the mechanics and details of how that is. So let's see here. Number 4 here, I wasn't super happy with this definition of a narrative as just a symbolic representation of events. That's focusing on the kind of plot aspect of a story, right? Which is a story or a drama, as Burke would say about dramatism. Dramatism has 5 elements. It has act, what is being done, actor, who is doing the doing, who or what is doing the action, actor. We got agency, how are they doing it, what tool, by what means. What else we got? We got scene, and I'm missing one. Agent, agency, act, crap. Anyway, the elements of character or elements of a drama, elements of a narrative involves these 5 elements. I should have this offhand. But anyway, when you think about a narrative, I don't just think of plot. I don't just think of story. I think about this whole kind of world of human drama playing out, right? So I think about characters. I think about tension. I think about challenges. I think about overcoming challenges. I think, yes, about the sequence of events, but it's not just the sequence of events. There's more going on here that we hook into. We hook into character. We hook into life experience. We hook into scenes and scenarios playing out that seem to resonate with us. And again, that's why narratives are so persuasive, because they tap into that stuff. They represent it to us, and it comes across in a really powerful way to most anyone, really. Watching a movie or a TV show or going to a play or reading a book, a picture book, a narrative book, a word book, right? These are all narratives, these are all stories, these are all dramas, and we love it all. I don't know, TikTok videos are little mini dramas, little mini videos, little mini stories. In the course of a minute, 30 seconds, you can have a little arc. You can have something happening, some tension, some funny little quirk or whatever. And within the span of just a few moments, you have a little narrative, a little drama. We love that stuff. All right. Yep. Number 6, number 5. Yep. Yep. Pay close attention to the 4 kinds of narrative persuasion. These are good. Yeah. Those are pretty easy. Number 8, I'll let you just get those. All right. So number 9 is pretty important. This idea of implicit versus explicit persuasion. And then the next thing where this is going is looking at the mechanics of persuasion within narratives. All right. So by now we should be pretty good on the difference between implicit and explicit. An explicit persuasive narrative is like a what do they call those? The public message. What do they call those? Public service announcement, right? It's like the more you know. It's obvious that this was put together to sell an idea, to promote something. So it's wearing its persuasive intent on its sleeve, essentially, right? Hey, this is what we would like you to do, think, believe, accept, want, buy, whatever, right? There it is. But more often than not, I think what we're talking about when we're talking about narrative persuasion, we're talking about implicit persuasion, right? And that's when things get really complex. Yeah, it matters whether audience members are forced to draw conclusions or, if forced to draw their own conclusions or if conclusions are drawn for them. I'm someone who likes a text to be kind of open. I don't want to be told. I don't want to be lectured to. I want stuff presented to me and let me figure it out. Let me kind of put it together in my own head. I can't stand being like holding my hand, telling me over and over again, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, this is the way they're supposed to do it. They don't do it. Now they're bad consequences. That all feels lectury, preachy. I don't like that, right? So I like to draw my own conclusions. And if I find myself being kind of led in a direction, I'm one of these resistant, reactant counter-arguers, right? As soon as I sense myself being led in a direction, I start to push back, right? So that's when they talk about in this chapter the story and the persuasion. And they talk about resources, the resources in the mind of the audience. It's almost like imagine you have a full tank of gas in your brain. That's energy, focus energy. It's kind of like that central processing power, right? And you're going to go watch a movie, and it's 2.5 hours long, and it's somewhat complex, right? So the idea here is that a lot of the tank of gas is going to get used up just following the story. Who's he again? Who's she again? Which side are they on? Right? Wait, is that the same person who did, like, that kind of energy? But then if there's persuasion built into the story, then the gas is also going to get used trying to suss out the persuasion part of it. So it's like you have these two kind of sort of sources of resource drain. One is the story itself, and the other is the story's persuasive properties. And the idea here is that audiences are generally most persuaded by a narrative when it does not require them to engage with the persuasive kind of dimension, that central processing, right? If you find that a narrative is coming at you persuasively, now you're going to use your resources to engage those and critique and kind of analyze that, and you're going to kind of start to like move away from the story elements a little bit. So the basic suggestion here seems to be, if a narrative is going to be more persuasive, it will be because it manages to sort of subdue the persuasive effort, right? So less explicit persuasion in a narrative actually promotes the persuasion within the story. So this idea of diffusion of the persuasion into the story, or integration, I think they call it, right? The more that the persuasive message is integrated into the story so that it's not coming at you, the softer the persuasion is when it's coming through the narrative, the more engaging the narrative is the main part of that, right? So if the narrative is engaging because the story is engaging, the characters, the tension, the drama itself, if that's what's got you focused and engaged, the persuasion stuff can be subtle and it can take you along through its subtlety, right? So it seems a little bit counterintuitive. Normally you would think more explicit persuasion would be better, but in the case of narratives, less explicit persuasion is the goal. All right. Number 11 there. Narratives are best at sliding past the reactions against explicit persuasion because of their entertaining and implicit nature. And so the persuasion is being kind of managed almost covertly. I'm trying to think of good examples here of like a movie, let's say, or a TV show that is persuasive, but doesn't come across as persuasive, right? I'd be curious if anyone has a good example of something that really kind of like moved them in a way where they came out the other side of watching this thing and they thought to themselves like, holy cow, I can't keep doing that, or I need to start doing that. And it was mostly because the story itself was so impacting, right? In any case, let's see here. Number 12 is important. It's the bottom of the notes here, but it's a big chunk of the reading. And my suggestion is, to just read through. What I don't want to do is to get into all of the literature that's cited. So as these persuasion scholars do, they like to cite all of the other social sciencey persuasion stuff to kind of like give a little survey of the issues that are covered and some of the tendencies. So that's the case for each of these subsections. We've got counter-arguing, and then we've got elaboration and inference, and then we've got imagery, and then we've got vicarious experience, and they go through and they kind of summarize the scholarship on each of these factors or mechanisms, and then they do a little summary. So definitely read the summary paragraph. It's the last paragraph for each of these subsections, where they basically explain like, what's going on with each of these mechanisms. So again, the mechanisms of persuasion, when we're thinking about counter-arguing, it's hard to summarize what's actually being promoted in the counter-arguing stuff. And at the end of the essay or the end of the chapter, the authors basically say, this is the area that really needs a lot of work. And I think the reason is because that whole explicit-implicit business, right? As soon as an audience member feels themselves being persuaded, everything changes. Certainly does for me, right? I'm happy to be shown something. I'm happy to be taken on a journey, but I cannot stand being lectured to. And there's many ways that narratives do this, by like repetition, constantly repeating, by over-explaining, by having characters say the same damn obvious thing over and over and over and over again. It's like, I get it. I know what you're trying to say here. The way the camera focuses, the way the mood swells, the dark mood, the happy music, right? All this kind of stuff that's cueing audience members like good over here, bad over here. Can't stand all that stuff. That makes me push back. If it's more subtle, if it's more ambiguous, if it's more complex, now I'm more engaged and I'm more likely to get kind of carried along with the persuasive message that way. So each of these things, counter-arguing, elaboration and inference, imagery, just think about the power of images, right? And how those things can have an impact on you persuasively. I'm thinking of some shocking, really difficult images that I've seen in movies, but you can also think of really like Bambi getting shot, Bambi's mom getting shot. I haven't seen Bambi in so long, but I still remember being traumatized by that as a little boy. Like, it's so sad, right? Down with hunters, right? So there's a persuasive message that's very sort of subtly coded in there in a very powerful way based on the imagery. And then vicarious experience. Vicarious experience, I'm running out of time here, but that's a really important one because that gets into Kenneth Burke and identification, right? Identification is me looking at the screen and being like, I like that person, I don't like that person, I identify with that person. You can identify with characters in ways that are positive, you can identify with characters in ways that are negative, like, ooh, that character, I do that. I hate that about myself, but I certainly understand that person doing it there. There's a whole complex set of kind of logistics to explain how we identify vicariously with what's going on the screen, which characters we identify with, and why. But sure enough, I think about narratives, I think about movies, I think about TV shows. I mean, think about, maybe one of the reasons why we love them so much is because they're almost like, I'm thinking of Disneyland here. You go into some of these rides, and they're literally immersing you in the story, like that Star Wars ride. I was just at Disneyland in May, and it was so cool, man. It's like you're in the world, right? Like you're on this thing, you're in it. And I think, the ride at Disneyland and the ride that you can go on when you turn your TV on, they're very close, right? One is on a screen two-dimensionally. The other one is a three-dimensional immersive thing. Again, video games, similar kind of phenomenon. We get immersed in these worlds give us this kind of vicarious transportational experience. I'm on a spaceship. I'm shooting bad guys, right? That vicarious experience is a really powerful way of showing people different things. I think there's a whole bunch more that we could talk about here. I frankly would love to just sit down and talk at great length about this particular element of persuasion, vicarious experience, identification. Think about video games. Think about narratives. Think about theme parks. Think about this idea of immersion. Think about I got my Meta goggles over there, the VR experience. We're moving more and more in that direction, right? Think about how it is we are augmenting our worlds with essentially kind of narrative properties, right? Like fun things. What was that movie, Ryan Reynolds, where he's that character in the background? Right? It's like, imagine a world where augmented reality is becoming increasingly true. That's now in a situation where narratives are actually like affecting our real lives. Anyway, we'll save that for later, but there's a lot of really good, important, powerful insights in here in terms of how it is that narratives work on us, what we kind of bring into them. So just to kind of summarize, narratives are very powerful, rhetorically, persuasively, and a lot of it has to do with what we as audience members kind of bring into it because they are so engaging, right? So the persuasion part operates a little bit differently than in normal kind of context because we are not expecting to be persuaded. In most cases, we don't want to be persuaded. We want to be engaged. We want to be entertained. We want to be transported and taken somewhere. So the persuasion needs to kind of take a back seat to that. But to the extent that it can, like give us this immersive, engaging experience and show us something different along the way or take us through this kind of transporting experience, then the persuasion has a better chance. All right, the conclusion is also good. There's some good summary type moments in there, and I'm beyond. I got to edit this down. So I'll get this up as soon as I can, and we'll move on to Fisher, and that's the end for Unit 3. See ya.